All right, so this is the third class in the RPH 205, Introduction to Ethics. And this is a class that's going to start out with some other great ideas. So last time it was Aristotle's great ideas, his theory of virtue. Today it's Plato's great idea and Plato's dialogues. So my claim is that Plato grew up in this wonderful democratic city, and in his lifetime, he watched it become corrupt and it self-destructed. It fell apart, and they elected a dictator. So they lost their democracy. So Plato, I don't know, he didn't know what to do for a while. He had planned to go into politics and decided that was no good. But he started a school, the Academy, which, as I mentioned in the first lecture, it was one of the first liberal arts colleges. And my claim is that he's telling people, his readers, the people who read Plato are future leaders. You have to have a lot of natural ability, a lot of motivation, and a lot of opportunity to be able to attend Plato's Academy. You might be in a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a constitutional government, but you're sent to Plato's Academy to study. And the ultimate message of Plato's Academy is, if you have that privilege, don't abuse it. Because if you use it to get rich or powerful, you will destabilize your country and you will lose it. Your children, your grandchildren, everyone will suffer, including you, but your legacy will be terrible. Anyway, so I'm going to pretend I'm Plato, and I'm going to tell you about my beautiful city and how we lost it and how agonizing that was. So let me start out with the outline. All right. So what I loved about our culture, I loved my city-state, Athens. And it's not because it's mine, it's not blind patriotism. I actually, it's at one point in my childhood, I realized I was lucky. I just happened to grow up in this incredible society. Plus, my uncle was the main person who wrote the Constitution of Athens. And so he was considered a great statesman because the art of statecraft, as you found out in Aristotle, is to weave the rich and poor together and to create a strong and stable middle class. And so Solon's constitution was written to try to structure things so that Athens would have a flourishing free society and it would not get destabilized and collapse into authoritarianism. But, and this is based again on the transition from living in just biological groups for the sake of living in simply economic groups or associations based on material well-being, living better in a material sense and being secure, coming together for security. But the highest level of culture is the polis, political association. That's where with Aristotle's virtues, the political virtues are really important. And so, so my uncle Solon was, I think, a good example of a political genius. What what would be someone who has this art of statecraft? Genius means actually the root is a daimon, a spirituality, somebody who loves justice and is capable of creating a body of laws or applying the laws or distributing social goods or punishing wrongs, always in a way that promotes flourishing. Those were the political virtues. So, what would uh, a community of just citizens look like? What would be all the different aspects of such a community? You'd have to create a system of laws and institutions that would promote moderation. Remember, moderation was really important. The development of a strong middle class, a system for creating and distributing wealth that prevents money from sticking to money, taxes the wealthy so that their children can't grow up without any engagement in civil life. Criminal justice system gives people opportunity for a fair trial. A commitment to avoid invading other countries and to much prefer diplomacy, right? And understanding that the art of diplomacy is much better than military. Creating just treaties so you won't get invaded and not invading another country, creating a body of allies to maintain your security and everybody's well-being. An educational system provides opportunities for citizens to develop their talents and use them. That would be rational ambition. And that rewards most of those with the most commitment to an ability to think clearly about the common good. So it's an education for understanding the common good. If there's some people that are particularly good at that, they would be given opportunities to rule because they've shown they have the capacity for it. And then an informal system of education. And so I will talk about that, the agora, the marketplace, and the theater. So the rest of this outline is related to the slideshow. So I'm going to show the slides and then we can move on. You can check out this outline later on. Here's the slide. All right. Here is my great city. I loved it so much. So you can see that at the level of nature, this is where we have families coming together on the earth, and then also where we have businesses taking place. But the Acropolis, the mountain, the rock that jutted out that was in the middle of the city, was where people started to cultivate practical wisdom, started to think like a citizen. So first they went to the theater and they slowly walked up to the temple of Athena. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, justice, and war, but it has to be a just war. She has a little half-brother who loves war, but he doesn't care if it's just or not. She's always yelling at him, keeping him under control. So the point here is that there's the temple, and the roof line of the temple is very similar to the mountains because human beings, their way of becoming completely human as a species is to build cities because they can only cultivate these higher order capacities for scientific inquiry, for artistic expression, for free speech, for free association. They have to have leisure time. They have to engage in deliberation for thinking about the common good. All of those higher capacities can only be realized in a city. But so this is where the particular animal that only flourishes within the context of a city. Okay, and here's the temple. Now, in a medieval cathedral, the cathedrals are built right in the middle of the dirty, noisy, disgusting city. And you walk through the door, and it's like a rocket ship to heaven. And the ceiling is really high, and there's chanting, and there's incense, and the light comes from above. So the whole message of a medieval cathedral is you should reject this world and get your whole mind oriented toward the next world, toward salvation after death. This is not the Greeks. The Greeks are saying virtue is natural, justice is natural. We cannot be fully human unless we love wisdom, justice, and truth and beauty. So it's a very slow walk up the hill. The steps are narrow and they're deep. So you just go very slowly because you want to integrate nature and culture. And then, okay, so you slowly walk up to the temple. Then another thing about the way it's built is that the columns are actually out of proportion, but in order to look like they're in proportion from the point of view of a person. So, people, are about that tall, so they have to make it to look proportionate. Why? Because we have a natural appreciation for proportionality and symmetry and beauty, because nature is ordered and proportional, and so that's part of our appreciation of beauty, is that it goes beyond simply nature to our higher order appreciation of beauty, which is we can appreciate proportionality, color, design, just for its own sake, not simply as a part of the rest of nature, but as a part of our own nature, to create artifacts that are beautiful. So if you remember, we have that art of production, but the production should always be consistent with human flourishing. Okay. Then, right next to the temple to Athena is the human court. This is where people come and make decisions based on the rule of law. So the message is that Athena, the goddess of wisdom and justice and war, is inspiring, triggering human beings. They have to remember her powers, and trigger and exercise their own capacity to make judgments that are wise and just, and be very careful about decisions related to war. Okay, they have to exercise, if you remember, the activities of soul, of making good laws, but then also applying the laws. If you remember, the judge has to have equity, or the jury. All right. Then halfway up the hill is the theater. So before you get to the temple, you walk past the theater, or you attend a theatrical performance. And the purpose of the theater is for the poets. They wrote stories about people who went to extremes. If you remember Aristotle, virtue is a mean between extremes. And you had all these virtues: temperance, courage, anger, friendships. Well, the stories in the tragedies and in Homer and in the music and dance, they're all related to what happens in a critical moment when people fly off the handle, right? They lose their cool, they get overly angry, or they chase after somebody sexually and cause a whole lot of problems, or they want to show how macho they are and they end up massacring people. All that stuff where these are all virtues, these are all the kinds of situations we get into. The tragedies, most of the characters make mistakes. There's one character that had good intentions, basically a decent character for the most part, but made a mistake and it led to a disaster. But there's always many other characters who also have their own opinions. And from what I know, the character traits of the other characters are not quite as strong. You know, that tragic one generally has a lot of virtues. They just made this big mistake. They're an intermediate type. The other types tend to be a little worse than the average person. And they have their own reasons, though, and they argue with each other, and all of them have good arguments. So the public is supposed to pay attention and realize, oh my gosh, I've gotten into arguments like that, or I've argued in my head like that. And they can identify with all of this. There also is usually one person who's better than most, or one person who, by the end of the play, has made a good judgment. They might have changed their mind. They might have always been making good judgments. Some of the characters, like in the chorus in Agamemnon, generally made good decisions, but one of their opinions was wrong and they changed their mind. And Aristotle says sometimes people with a strong character act out of character and they make a mistake, but they're self-correcting. They learn from their mistakes. But there's other people who have the wrong goals and they're constantly calculating how to achieve the wrong goal. And there's characters like that in the tragedies. There are characters that are morally strong. They don't want to do what's right, but they do it. They're morally weak. Helen, I know in at least one of the stories, regretted in Homer. She regretted what she had done when she ran away with Paris. That's in the Odyssey. So you can, Aristotle's list of the types of character, then there are the self-indulgent ones who just have the wrong goals. All the different virtues, you can just, I wrote some books where I went through each character, each situation, and used Aristotle. It's phenomenal how easy it is to do that. But it's also a learning experience. And also, overall, you get this picture in the back of your mind of how complex human life is and how complex the human condition is and how difficult it is to live a good life, to make good judgments all the time, even when you're caught in a really crisis situation. And so you're supposed to internalize those dialogues so that if you find yourself in a critical moment, you'll stop yourself. You'll have some resilience. You'll avoid overreacting. I remember in my life, I had just happened to see a tragedy and all this, never thinking I'd get in a situation like that. And about a year later, I did. And I remembered that. And I thought, don't do that. It was very helpful. And so I just figured, yeah, that's the way they all should have been. Or the Greeks, because they know the stories, they can tell each other, you're acting like Ares, don't do that. Or you're acting, you got a hero complex, stop. You're acting like Achilles, stop. You're acting like, and so they have a base of stories from which they can control their own behavior and other people's behavior. And that's, again, a part of self-examination, examining yourself, avoiding extremes. So that you flush out purgation. So the word catharsis, which is the goal of these stories, a purgation of pity and fear. you have emotional poison. And so you pity, you identify with the characters, you fear for your own ability to do that. And then you flush that emotion and that bad opinion out of your system. And if it appears at some critical moment, you go, shh, no, I'm not going to do that. So you have doctors had a medical purgation. If you have poison in your body, you're physically sick. You drink a potion, you throw up, you have diarrhea, you get the poison out. You go to a tragedy, you get the poison out. You read a Platonic dialogue that it's titled, the name is a character that has a bad opinion, a false opinion. And so you remove the obstacles. So an opinion is a blockage to the light of the mind. It's blocking you from being able to have good judgment, which is a kind of light that you shed in the world when you're making good decisions. So you have a blockage, and the tragedy, it releases, removes that blockage. So you are able then to make the right judgment rather than what the characters do. So you have flushed all that stuff out. Then you're ready to go up to the Temple of Athena. Then you're ready to go over to the courthouse and make some decisions. All right, so the Olympics. That was based on a sound mind and a sound body. So the goal wasn't just to be physically fit, but physical fitness was an important part of living a complete life. And a complete life is a life driven by your mind, but it's not separated off from your body. You have to have integrity. You have to have the integration of emotions, thoughts, and actions. And again, I mentioned that, I think, in Aristotle's Virtue. The other thing about the Olympics was it was intended to replace preparation for war. So in the city-states, there were a lot of wars or rumors of wars. And in Sparta, they sent their 7-year-old boys to military school where you learned patriotism, you learned obedience to your military generals or officers, and, and you fought all these wars to win. You got status when you acted courageously in battle. If you were good enough in battle, you were a general. If you're good enough general, you become a political leader. So the whole city was oriented toward victory in war, as Aristotle said. But Athens was not oriented. It was oriented toward the good life, intellectual inquiry, scientific inquiry, artistic expression, um, freedom of speech, citizen engagement in public life. They were required to be on juries, and they were also required to vote at the assembly. That's the democracy we hear about when we hear about Athens. But anyway, so the Olympics were set up as an alternative because you had to have young men who were physically fit, but the Olympics itself is trying to prevent war because the representatives, athletes from every city-state came to the Olympia, and they camped out in the same place. They got to know each other. The athletes got to know each other. The coaches got to, the trainers. And they're also soulmates, right? They have the same kind of soul, what they care about. So you're less likely to go to war with somebody if you actually know them. You have some friendship bonds. Aristotle again said friendship bonds are so important in a stable society. And then they had the way they structured the Olympics, many different aspects of it were designed to aim for that sound mind and a sound body. And toward the end of the class, last part of the class, I'll talk more about that. Then on another side of the Acropolis, here's the temple to Hephaestus. He's the god of the forge. He's an artisan, and his wife is Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty. So when he's inspired by Aphrodite, he creates things that are beautiful and they're well crafted. They're not cheap. They're not thoughtlessly put together. They're careful so that when you look at it, you know that a skilled artisan actually took time to make this product. And you sort of are in the presence of the minds of skilled people, people who love beauty just for its own sake. Okay, and this is the view that from the temple to Hephaestus, it's looking down at the marketplace. So, and it's at one side of the Acropolis, obviously. So, people from rural areas, so the people who voted in the assembly and were on juries, some of them were from the city, but many of them were from rural areas. They came into Athens on market day and they bought their stuff, but right next to it, there was the place to cultivate citizen consciousness, right? You're responsible to be a good citizen and you're responsible to become informed about public affairs. So, in that part of the marketplace, there was a building where the counselors, the leaders of the assembly, there was a group of people who decided which issues were going to be voted on first. Okay. And right at that building was posted what issues were being voted on in the assembly, so that when the rural people came to buy their stuff, they became informed. They found out what's going on in the assembly. Then there was some apartments where the people from rural areas who had been chosen lived, because of course they had to live somewhere. And outside of that was a list of the jury trials being held. Okay, so now you've got the info. Then there's a place, open place, where people were, there's some small temples to Zeus, god of justice, Athena, goddess of wisdom and justice, Ares, god of war, reminding you, make sure to make judgments that are wise and just, and please avoid war if you can. Don't be like Ares. Um, Remember, Athena and Zeus tried to keep him under wraps. Don't glorify war. So you go to that open space and people would gather there and they would talk about public affairs. That's how they educated themselves, okay? They didn't have all the technology or all the stuff that we have. That's how they found out what was going on. And that's also how they learn to deliberate. So if they come every week or two, over time, they get a whole history of what's been going on. How did the vote go? What were the consequences of that vote? Did it play out? What lessons were learned, good or bad, from this or that vote? Who's most prominent? Like Alcibiades, Nicias, who are these characters that are recommending that we do this or that? And what are they like? Should we trust them? So if you think about how difficult it would have been at that time to keep communication lines open, to keep the citizens informed, definitely, this is amazing. Everything possible for them to have access to the information they needed. Okay, here is down at the end of the peninsula is a temple to Poseidon, god of the sea. So Poseidon, there's the Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean Sea sort of meet right down there at the end of the peninsula. And then this is indicative of there were two different ways to think about the gods, the stories of the gods. So you could think about them as psychological, is about how the psyche works, like Zeus is the god of justice. So he inspires us when we try to figure out how to make judgments about rule for the sake of the ruled. But there were also stories about Zeus or the gods causing natural events. Okay. So, two different ways of understanding the mythological tradition. Then, out in the islands, as part of that revelation that Aristotle said, all human beings by nature seek understanding. Just that, aha, we are the creature that can understand patterns in a world where the patterns exist. So, following through on that, there were a number of different speculative philosophers who were positing what is that ordering force that underlies everything else that causes the order that we see. And they would be on different islands or different parts. They were usually a ways away from the city, and they would live in community. And they tried to maintain that intuition about reality in their day-to-day life together. So Democritus, for example, thought that everything is made up of these tiny little things called atoms. The word atom just means the smallest thing. And the reason things look different is because they had different shapes and different spins. And so today there are physicists like that who are always looking for the smallest possible particle, or they built this huge expensive thing that causes particles to crash into each other so that you can find the smallest particles or something like that. Those would be the Democriteans. Then there's Parmenides, who said all is one. There's this underlying unity and everything else is secondary in reality. And then there's Heraclitus. The only thing that doesn't change is the law of change. So he's always talking about flow and flux. And they're just, yeah. Empedocles is the recycling guy. Earth, air, fire, and water are in a cycle that keeps repeating itself, sustaining itself. Anyway, though even today, there are scientists who realize that the archetype, the fundamental principle that they accept, actually, there's a Greek pre-Socratic philosopher who actually had that view. So they're out there speculating. Then we also had a very sophisticated healthcare system. And because of sciences, we encouraged science. And that the first island off of the Piraeus, the port at Athens, the first island you get to, there is a women's health center. It's a temple at the top of the hill, and women would come take care of their uniquely female issues. I'm sure menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause, whatever. So that was something we prided ourselves on, how sophisticated we were. And then we always have dialogue. So everything about this tradition is dialogue, right? Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians, Plato, everybody's talking. And they're talking about beauty, truth, goodness, all this wonderful stuff. And before you make any kind of practical decision, you have this dialogue. What's best? Where are the experts? Blah, 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 blah. So it isn't you follow a rule and you apply a principle. It's all about dialogue. So then Corinth was nearby, right? And it's another city-state, and it has an acropolis. It had a temple to Apollo, the god of reason. Then there was Delphi and Mount Parnassus. And Delphi was like the United Nations. Um, it was where rulers, if they wanted advice, they always came to Delphi. And the priests there were, oh, that's it's a really long story, which I don't think I'll tell the whole story of it. But it's an international center. It integrates nature and culture. So Apollo, the god of reason, um, it had been a goddess-centered place for goddess culture, which was protected by a snake, a python, because the python sheds its skin and replaces it every year, but it's a cycle. It's the same every year. So that's the kind of culture that's linked closely to natural cycles. So at a certain point in human evolution, 800 BC, the axial age, societies became complex enough so that there was that aha, we recognize patterns. And then Apollo, the god of science, math, um, logic, that those capacities were going to drive civilization from now on. Skills, production skills. That's what's going to drive society. And history is going to be linear. Those technical science, math, technology, those skills are going to make societies more complex with every generation. And so history, human history will change and it will become linear. So Apollo replaced the goddess, international culture, and Apollo and Dionysus. So when you split off, Apollo is emotional. You have to be repressed emotionally in order to sit and do your logic or your science or whatever. But you have to have an emotional release. So you have to balance reason with emotion. And 9 months out of the year, Apollo governed the site, but 3 months out of the year, he gave his, when the fumes, when the site was dormant, he gave his favorite lyre to Dionysus, which is a wild, Dionysus is a wild child. And he had his women friends who danced these very frenzied dances. So for 3 months, Dionysus governed, and it was pretty wild and woolly over there. At the temple, before so that leaders would come for advice, and they'd walk up the hill, and they'd walk past, okay, and they'd walk up the hill and they would at the temple before they got the advice, the temple, it's engraved, know thyself and nothing in excess. So you know yourself as having a mind, wisdom, the capacity for wisdom, practical wisdom, right? So you're coming to the site to get advice about some decision, to get practical wisdom. So know yourself as a person who's capable of that, but who's also, yeah, nothing in excess, is to make sure you aren't being driven by greed or power lust or popularity, because you will make a mistake in judgment. Okay, so that's, oops. So there's also a theater that's above. There's the theater, and there's the temple is below it. Again, you have to flush out all those excesses from your emotional system, your emotions and thoughts, and then you can go listen to the oracle. Now, and there's an Olympic stadium too, so you have to have a sound mind and a sound body. That's part of the Greek ideal. If you're a good leader, you should really lead by example. Okay, and then, okay, when you go to get the oracle, to get the, you're asking for advice, you have to pass by a temple to Athena. So this, and if when you turn around the bend and you look up, the temple is up on a hill, right? I showed you that. The stadium is way up there, and then the theater, and then the temple. And you see it from afar, but what you see in front of you is a temple to Athena. So that reminds you that this particular Apollo is going to be inspired by Athena and also protected by Athena. So the advice you get will be motivated by the love of wisdom and justice. Then also, the laws are written on stone. And so, but the laws are different from the priest does not give you an answer to your question. He gives you a riddle. And so you have to solve that riddle. But the way you solve it is going to be a reflection of your character. If you are corrupt, if you really want to go to war for money or power, you will not interpret the riddle appropriately, and you'll make a mistake and you'll bring yourself or your city to a bad end. So there was a famous story. Well, a king came and asked if he should go to war. And the oracle said, if you go to war, a great empire, a great city will fall. Of course, he wanted to use that to justify going to war. It turns out it was his city. So, those oracles are ambiguous, and you have to be thoughtful about how you interpret them. And it's not the oracle's fault if you end up making a mistake. You can't justify it, but, well, the oracle told me to do that. Not so. I think this is true of all wisdom literature. It's why it's crazy to me that people justify doing irrational things by quoting from the Bible or quoting from the Bhagavad Gita or quoting from the Quran. It's just, those books are riddles and they say a lot. And every time you make a decision, you have to know that the holy books are going to give you more than one message. It'll be ambiguous. You have to take responsibility for your own interpretation or for which quote you pick and how you act on it. So it's not, you can't blame Muhammad or the Hindu Veda creators or Confucius, or you can't blame those people. You are responsible for how you apply that moral lesson, moral framework. Same with Aristotle's virtues. Okay, so this is the perfectly healthy person. And so this is a class about health. Is Hygeia, Hygiene. She's the daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine. So she's the goddess of health, but it's mental, physical, it's spiritual, it's emotional. It's a very holistic view of health. Okay, so then I thought we had this great ideal, right? Well, then let me tell you what happened. All right, so we fought against the Persians, and they were barbarians. They just had one leader who would go out in the public dressed up like a demigod, and everybody worshiped him. And oh my God, they had an empire and they attacked us. And we thought they were uncivilized, right? They're just uncultivated. They keep all their people stupid. And we're trying to cultivate our people, and our people are so much more sophisticated. We have so much better a culture. So this isn't just about power, it's about civilization, preserving civilization. And so we actually used a lot of thinking and strategy, and we defeated the Persians. Yay. And so we had this huge flourishing. This isn't just about power, this is about the gods are on our side. We have a superior culture. Well, then, even before that war was over, there were two major city-states, the most powerful city-states, Sparta and Athens. And the Spartans, as I said, valued victory in war. And the Athenians, oh no, it's the arts and the sciences and all this stuff. Conversations, blah, blah. All right, so what did the Spartans think of the Athenians? Well, they were degenerate, unpatriotic, undisciplined, out of control. And what did the Athenians think of the Spartans? They're barbarians, they're mindless, they're just marching orders. Forget it. Well, they didn't like each other's culture. They also got into a power struggle. So that's what happened. Okay, so let me go back, tell you how we corrupted everything. Everything got corrupted. So we're in a power struggle with the Spartans. And every other city-state, the other city-states are thinking, keep us out of it. You go fight each other, just beat each other up, kill each other off. We don't care, just keep us out of it. Nope, that's not what they did. So the island of Delos, for example, was strategically located, and it was an island. And so the Melians knew that the Spartans or the Athenians were going to come and try to control them. So the Melians said, we don't want either one of them to control us. We are going to band together. We're going to resist. So the Athenians were the ones to come first. And the Melians said, get out. And the Athenians said, sorry, if we don't take you into our league, to our power group, then either the Spartans will come and get you, or the Spartans will think we were too weak, and they'll just come and get us in Athens. So you have to come with us. And the Melians fought bravely. They resisted. But the Athenians wiped them out, okay? Massacred them, just devastated them. And so, and the quote from Thucydides is, might makes right. Sorry, buddy. This is the real world. We're going to be realists now. Yeah, sure. Okay, so then, all right, so now we have to look at all this stuff over again. Where did they get the money to build all these monuments to democracy? And they also built them in every city-state that became their ally. They built another monument. Where did they get the money? Ah, they taxed their allies, so none of their allies could have this wonderful free and open society. And also they took the spoils of war, which is very bad to benefit from the spoils of war, because then you'll keep going to war to get money. So naughty, naughty. In the name of democracy, they devastated their allies and their enemies. They exploited them, and they didn't give them a chance to have their own flourishing society. Well, so much for that. What happened to Athena? Judgments about justice and injustice were corrupted, right? It was might makes right. So justice is rule for the benefit of the ruled. For Athens, it started to become rule for the benefit of empire building, right? We want to control, we want power, and we want money. So Athena was corrupted. Beauty, proportionality. So their desires, the Athenians' desires, were all out of proportion. They were excessive, too much power, too much money, emotionally out of control. What about the decisions in the law courts? Well, this is where the educational system became a huge problem because foreigners from other city-states came into Athens and they developed a technique of teaching the best and the brightest. They charged a lot of money. So only the privileged class could learn these lessons. And they were about persuasion, using logical fallacies so that when you speak in front of the assembly or you speak in front of the courts, you can manipulate the people into agreeing with you, can appeal to emotion. So when the people came in from the countryside and sat in the agora and talked, they learned how to deliberate, right? They didn't try to screw each other over. They didn't try to manipulate. They were conversing. And if someone was arrogant, you could see that they were arrogant. You could say, you don't know that. You're not that powerful. But when the best and the brightest would get these very sophisticated lessons in how to manipulate a jury, the ordinary people just couldn't, figure out that they're getting jerked around. So they became unable to make very good decisions. They also started expecting to be manipulated. And so gradually that whole process became corrupted. If you had enough money to pay a sophist, you were going to be able to do whatever you wanted. How did the theater get corrupted? Well, people started thinking that the poets were glorifying these extreme emotions instead of trying to flush them out. They were saying, hey, that's cool, let's do it. No, they can't even get their own tradition. The Olympics were corrupted because the athletes got more and more specialized. They had their own coaches and their own trainers, and nobody else. It was supposed to be everybody being physically fit, and it turned out to be highly professionalized. And when people went to the Olympics, everybody watching was just a couch potato. It was a big drinking party. And the cities spent money preparing for the Olympics instead of spending money for wellness programs for their own people. What about Hephaestus? His craftsmanship now is just being dedicated to swords and shields, right? The equipment for war. So all of that beauty, all of that craftsmanship, all of a sudden just gets put to the purpose of war making. What went on in the Agora? Well, the Athenians thought that if they had all these economic treaties with other city-states, so they sold all sorts of trinkets from every city-state, they thought they would create these friendship bonds, economic bonds. Well, the other side of it is that when Athenians could see that other cities had different religions, different values, they just became moral relativists. Like, who cares about the gods? It's all made up, and every city's got a different god, and there's no moral lessons there. Plus, they started making unfair treaties, right? Because they're Athens and they can do what they want. They're the biggest trading partner, so they can wrap you around your finger. So it wasn't working the way it was supposed to be. It wasn't necessarily leading to some sort of peace and diplomacy between the city-states. It became a source of aggravation. Then Poseidon, he had seen the ships go out to fight the Persians during a just war. Now he's watching the Athenians go out against the Spartans, which is an unjust war. It's totally different. The spirit of the times has changed from, celebrating supposedly a free and open society and humanity to basically celebrating money and power. So then the city started to fall apart because the middle class was shrinking, destabilizing, just like Solon knew, is that you've got to have a strong middle class, or if you shrink the middle class, you're going to get instability, and some authoritarian, power-hungry political leader is going to step in there. So now, instead of just letting some people thought Zeus caused thunderbolts, some people thought it was nature. Now people are getting more conservative. They want traditional understandings of religion. They don't like those speculative people because they're all atheists. They don't believe in the gods. And so the other reason for why the speculative thinkers might have been out on islands is they didn't want to get killed. They didn't want to get accused of being atheists and end up getting killed. So that's another reason they could have run away. What about women's health? Well, I'm sure it wasn't all peachy keen. Some women came there because they're getting abused, and there's a dark side to women's health too. Now, what about all these wonderful conversations? They're getting corrupted, right? By the desires, the impulses, the greed, the pride, the heroism, false heroism, popularity of the masses, of especially the privileged class. So what did so Socrates was my teacher, although he wasn't officially a teacher because he didn't take any money. He was just a stonecutter, and when he's done with work, he would go to the agora. He would talk to whoever was there, and he would ask them, what is justice? What is virtue? What is beauty? And he would ask military leaders, what is courage? He would ask political leaders, what is justice? And they couldn't answer them. And other people were watching, and so these leaders were getting humiliated. So the public had trusted them with the money and power they had, and they were not proving that they were trustworthy. So Socrates was trying to make the Athenians honest. He was trying to make them transparent. In a democracy, you have to be transparent about how you're using your power and accountable, right? How do you know that's the right decision? So Socrates was being the very best citizen to keep the city honest. Is that what the people thought? No. They took him to court for being an atheist. He didn't have traditional values and not believing in the city's gods. Okay. So, well, before that, Athens had fallen apart, and another one of my uncles, Critias, said, if you vote for me, the Spartans won the war, but they let us vote for a president. They didn't want to get involved in our politics. They just took away our military power. So my uncle Critias said, if you vote for me, I'll bring us back to traditional family values, traditional religion, blind obedience, patriotism, traditional family. And that's exactly what Athens was not, because those tragedies show the dysfunction within families and how it creates political dysfunction. It's trying to get you to think about your families and, function better. it's getting away from blind patriotism. There's characters who are blindly patriotic. They make bad judgments, and also blind faith. And there's characters that have this blind faith that it's God's will. But if you're watching the tragedy, you know it's not God's will, it's Agamemnon's will. And he's a jerk. So it's trying to get people to think critically, but it's not what the Athenians wanted. Socrates was the greatest gift. They took him to court, and he was found guilty. So he was killed, okay? And that's why I was thrown off Plato. I had, I thought Socrates was great. And I watched my city fall apart. And I just, for a while, I just didn't know what to do. I had no plans. Then I decided to create the academy and to raise future leaders. Here's the hemlock that Socrates had to eat, I guess. Oh, a potion made out of hemlock, and it killed him. And so now we have dialogues. There's all sorts of restaurants. This is taken at a restaurant. The top of the building has these balconies with restaurants. There's Lycavito's Hill. So we're supposed to debate what has changed and what hasn't about Athens. And how can you compare that to your own country? So your country might be moving toward democracy, or it might be losing its democracy, somewhere on that trajectory. And so you compare, what about my country? Is it well structured? Is the structure good, but the leaders are corrupt? Or are the leaders good, but the structure is corrupt? Are the citizens do they have virtues? Can we preserve this? Can we avoid authoritarianism? And clearly, throughout the world at this moment, a whole lot of countries are becoming corrupt, and the people are falling in for social media posts that distort, right? The rhetoric appeals to fear, appeals to emotion, and these democracies are getting lost. So you can compare that to the story of Athens, and there's a sunset, and then it had a beautiful ideal, right? It was just the beginning. There's plenty of things wrong with Athens, obviously. Only men could vote, lots of other stuff. But the idea there was good, and we can keep expanding it. But at this moment, it's getting worse. So throughout the world, we're losing democracies. And so it's a problem. And I've spent my career teaching Plato, because in 1973, I think I took a Plato class. And ever since then, I thought, boy, people need to know this, because I lived during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And there was a lot of questioning of American imperialism, of the power of money in our military system. I mean, all the things that are still true today. So I have spent my career for many years, 45, 50 years, teaching Plato's, and just every time the audience kind of lights up, because they usually agree, even if they're self-described conservative or liberal, they'll agree in principle. They just disagree on the particulars of which thing is the most corrupt. Each of them will say, yeah, that's why those liberals are so horrible, or that's why those conservatives. Well, both sides have their weaknesses and their strengths. And Plato is trying to tell you to wake up and don't lose your democracy, whatever else you do. Engage in dialogue, be self-controlled, exercise virtue. But if you don't, if you're not diligent, and now that I'm older, I just think the artists have to constantly be doing due diligence, constantly be telling stories that'll flush out the vices of people, because just ignorance, just not being aware of what's going on politically. And then all of a sudden it hitting your face, and all of a sudden you start thinking, but you don't think very well because now you're in a more desperate situation. You'll tend to believe rhetoricians. So that's very discouraging, but I hope the next generation can pick up from that. So that's the lecture on Plato. But I had another reading because there was no reading from that, and that was the myth of normal. So the myth of normal, I think it's a 25-page reading, I'm not sure. But here's the summary, and it is clearly related to Plato and Athens. He starts out, he is a doctor and a stress specialist, but he says the US is health obsessed, right? People are obsessing about their health, and lots of people are making lots of money, but our health is getting worse. Why? Because the social and emotional context people live in and the ideological blind spots. They have this blind faith in a free market. And so corporations can sell you any of this stuff. But his conclusion is that chronic illness, okay, mental and physical, is a function, a feature of our culture, not a glitch. It's not just, oh, every society has its problems or something. It's like built in to being a citizen and conforming or trying to be normal in American society. It's a myth because it's not normal. So he says we have a toxic culture. The entire context of social structures, belief systems, assumptions, values that surround us and pervade every aspect of our lives is toxic, makes us sick. The total commercial environment, especially the way that corporations are always trying to sell you stuff everywhere you turn. This is growing stress, inequality is growing, climate catastrophes are increasing. Children are being medicated without any knowledge about the long-term effects. And we've become acculturated to these things that plague us. We consider it normal, like obesity is normal. 80% of Americans over age 50 have a metabolic disorder. The food they've eaten has destroyed their metabolic system. 80% people over 50. Okay, much of what, it's becoming normalized. It's not healthy or normal. So we conform to requirements that are profoundly abnormal in regard to our nature-given needs, which is just general healthy food, and also stress levels are unnatural. Illness is expected, and then people make money on keeping you ill. They make money on making you ill and then keeping you ill. Our country's skewed idea of normality is the single biggest impediment to fostering a healthier world. Okay, so that's important. The current paradigm for a doctor is if you come sick, he tries to find a physical cause and then give you a pill. So that if you just change your body chemistry, you'll get well. But it's not that, because the culture keeps reinforcing the diseases, and they're not just physical diseases. The stress, you can't separate one part of their body from another, or their body from their mind, or their social environment. So again, if you remember Aristotle, the important thing was having this middle class. When the middle class shrinks, there's instability, and there's stress, and there's mental health. Okay, so he tells a story of he decided as a doctor to start asking people questions about their lives, not just about where does it hurt. And he, right away, there's an association. There's some kind of breakdown in their social life. There's circumstances that has caused them to lose resilience, so they're more vulnerable to outside. We're all exposed to germs all the time that if we're healthy, our bodies resist it. But these relationship issues can often make us more vulnerable. But he says we can return to what nature intended, but we have to go counterculture. It's not necessarily genetics. A lot of what goes on is the expression of genes. You can have a capacity for alcoholism, but if you live a certain way, it'll never kick in. Whereas you can have not a genetic, but for some other emotional reason, you become dependent on alcohol. Then capitalism, like he's down on capitalism. So it's a competitive ideal, and making competition the status quo divides. So people don't have trust and goodwill. They aren't generous. They're not self-controlled. You just keep feeding the irrational emotions. Getting rich is good. It'll motivate you. That's intemperance. And you're not generous, and the rich are not magnanimous. And so people get stressed, they get angry too soon, they have anger issues, people can't be ambitious because a huge chunk of people don't have access. They can't pay for the education to develop their talents. It just goes on and on. You could go through a whole list of the way these virtues are all corrupted by greed, especially. Capitalism is more than just an economic doctrine. I talked about that before. It's a whole ethic, teachings about how people should behave, educate their children, and think that economic growth is the supreme good. And because all these other goods depend on it, that's a lie. It's not true. And so not only that, it's leading to the destruction of the environment, which leads to more climate disasters, and which leads to more stress and more suffering. And so this is a theme that will come up again and again. A number of the people we read in the first section of the course criticize capitalism, greed. That Aristotle said that greed is the vice that destroys societies. Hello. And here we are. We're thinking, no, greed is good. It's like, no. 2,500 years ago, they figured this out. Don't you read history? Can't you read into history? Can't you understand these patterns? The medical system is just part of it. It's atomized. People are isolated from context. Their own mental and physical distress is their problem. It's not related to social contexts when it really is. Neoliberalism has cut taxes, so you're cutting social programs, making corporations even more powerful. You're cutting educational, everything that would enable people in the bottom 2/3 to develop their own humanity and to function at a higher level is being cut. And the rich are just getting richer, and the laws allow them to give their money to their children. Their children are developing a totally separated class oligarchy, a rich class that doesn't have anything, doesn't depend at all on the rest of society. So it's not democracy. And we're exporting this way of life. Okay, Stiglitz is another Nobel Prize winning economist. Capitalism is failing to produce what it promised, and it's delivering on what was not promised globally inequality, pollution, unemployment, the degradation of value. Everything is acceptable, no one is accountable. People see themselves as victims of blind economic forces. The feeling of despair and hopelessness. So my point there, first of all, is to get the idea that health includes physical, mental, spiritual, social, emotional, all this stuff is connected. And we live in America is a toxic culture, and the driver of this toxicity is this belief that greed is good. You should get your identity caught up in how much money you make or how much stuff you have. And in the meantime, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the middle class is shrinking. But if you are going to do healthcare in the United States, you really need to know that, because so many people are going to come to you. The bottom 2/3, their sicknesses could easily be connected to stress or other issues. So if you're practicing in another country, you should probably understand how the international system is also trying to co-opt your country, take away its traditional culture. I know when I go to Indonesia, when I taught in Bangladesh, people are eating junk food. Um, I couldn't believe it, how many students, it's just this mass culture. I had a student whose brother was taking this growth hormone that he'd found out about online. It was just, people in developing countries, oh yeah, they're buying lotion that will bleach their skin so they can look more Western. It's terrible, right? So the exploitation of natural resources, deforestation, species loss of species, all this stuff, air pollution, water, all this stuff is going on between nations, within a nation, and American capitalism is the major driver. So I do think the Greeks have a lot to offer. Plato's story of Athens and Aristotle's virtues. And that's what we will do throughout the class. We'll include that view of health and that context, that wisdom, traditions. We can look to them for some insight, but we also have to look forward to where I'm going as a systems paradigm for how to think about reality. But first, we have to explain where we are and how we got here.